to a record low against the dollar. $1 now costs more than 82 rupees. The Indian currency has depreciated by 8 rupees so far this year. Stock markets recovered in the last hour to pare most of the losses. Sensex and Nifty end the week with gains of over 1%. All sectoral indices end the week with gains except the Nifty FMCG index. Troubled Swiss lender Credit Suisse outlines a $3 billion debt buyback plan as it attempts to reassure investors about its future. The bank will also sell a famous hotel in Zurich and unveil a new business strategy later this month. US President Joe Biden warns the world could face an Armageddon if Russia's Vladimir Putin uses a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. In a stark assessment, Biden says that this is the closest the world has come to a nuclear disaster since the 1960s. The government notifies collateral-free debt funding scheme for startups. Startups which have stable revenue stream are not in default situation can avail the scheme. The maximum guarantee cover per borrower, however, shall not exceed 10 crore rupees. Hero MotoCorp launches its first electric scooter at a starting price of 1.45 lakh rupees. Bookings start from the 10th of October and deliveries will begin from the second week of December. Election Commission writes to the Law Ministry to allow one candidate to fight from one seat according to sources. As per current laws, one candidate can contest from 2 seats. Well, hello and welcome to Business 360. I'm Ashmit Kumar. Now, the Election Commission's proposal to mandate more disclosures from political parties to explain possible ways of financing poll promises has sparked a debate. Now, several opposition parties have slammed the move as an overreach. The letter on poll promises comes just months after the EC told the Supreme Court that it will not want to regulate policy decisions by political parties. In fact, joining us now to discuss this further is with us the Finance Minister of Tamil Nadu, Mr. Thiagarajan. Mr. Thiagarajan, thank you so much for taking our time and speaking to CNBC TV18. The first question I want to ask you is, this is fresh on the heels of the latest move coming by the Election Commission. I just want to draw your attention to the tweet from this morning. I woke up to this tweet. It says, when it suits social welfare, when it does not, freebie. Would you care to expand on that?
First, thank you for having me. I've had this discussion multiple times over the last 2-3 years, going back to the terms of reference of the 15th Finance Commission, where they gave a reference saying that there should be a kind of negative weighting or a discouragement given to people who did populist measures. At the time, I asked the question in writing on behalf of the DMK, what do you define as populist measures? In a democracy, it's very hard that you have an arbiter, a neutral arbiter that says which is populist and which is welfare. So I reiterate that point multiple times in the last kind of 2 months or so. First of all, I'm shocked that such an issue should be in the courts, any court in any democracy, because the courts are there to kind of adjudicate the law, not to preempt it, not to say what should and shouldn't be acceptable in the way the administration works. The second question is, how is it that when the union government makes a decision to give free food to 800 million people coincidentally ahead of elections, and it costs 40-something thousand crores, that's not considered a freebie? But heaven forbid that somebody else should give something else, then it's called revdi culture. So this kind of one rule for me, one rule for everybody else, which is characteristic of this union government.
Sure.
I think this is just a prime example of that.
The follow-up question I want to ask is that this move by the Election Commission to seek the advice from various political parties is being termed as a volte-face. The reason being that in their earlier position before the Apex Court, they had clarified that they want to have nothing to do with this. They don't even want to be on the expert panel, as that would add a political color. But now we find that just days after that, the Election Commission has taken on a new position whereby it is now seeking advice on how perhaps it can be included measures against freebies within the model code of conduct. Does this perhaps raise questions in terms of how the EC has gone about this volte-face, as it's being called?
Yeah, I mean, for the benefit of most people, I would call it a dramatic U-turn, right? What you'd call the volte-face. So I say, of course, it raises concerns, right? It raises concerns far beyond this one instance. It raises concerns about the neutrality of the Election Commission. It raises concerns about the rationality or application of mind of the Election Commission. If you can appear in the Supreme Court of India and give one statement, and then 30 or 60 days later, you do a completely opposite thing, then it questions whether this is functioning as a truly independent and sane, logical entity or not. And as with many other institutions in India, it creates the concern that there has been a capture of institutions or erosion or decay of institutions. And this is completely, unhealthy for democracy. And it's more than that, right? Because in the history of the world, there has never been a good outcome for increasing capture of
Sure.
institutions, right? Even this old kind of, what can I say, fake adage that said, Mussolini was authoritarian, but the trains ran on time. In fact, the trains never ran on time. The more you take control of systems and you destroy the nature of a democracy and of a multifaceted system, the more you concentrate power in one place and make it a one-side game, you are guaranteed to fail economically.
Sure.
In development, there's no debate here. So of course, it raises concerns about whether the Election Commission is A, neutral, and B, applying its mind consistently if it can go from black to white in less than 60 days.
Sure. I spoke to some lawyers who, in fact, have been, raising concerns on behalf of the petitioners. What they point out is that this latest move by the Election Commission is merely fine-tuning of a guideline which is already in existence since 2013. Post the Subramanian Balaji verdict, Supreme Court asked the EC to formulate guidelines. It did formulate the guideline and very clearly laid out that parties must demonstrate the rationale for the promise and indicate ways and means to meet financial requirements. This was an EC guideline going back to 2015 Model Code of Conduct. The question that is now being asked, just to play the devil's advocate, is why make a fuss now? This has already been in existence for over 7 years.
I agree and I disagree. I agree in the sense, if that had been their position, they should have stated that in the Supreme Court 2 months ago or 40 days ago, whenever it was. I still worry about an institution that says black in the Supreme Court and then goes and does white in a letter to parties. So, at that level, I still think it causes a loss of trust in the independence and sanity of the institution if it does such U-turns. At a different level, I couldn't agree more with you. I have no problem with the logic either in 2013 judgment or the 15 guidelines or today, where they say parties should be asked to validate. My question is, the history of our accounting systems and our methodology leaves a lot to be desired. If you look at the last, let's say, 5 years or 8 years of both financial statements of the states as well as the union, you take the projection under the FRBM mandated MTFP, medium-term fiscal plan, you take the budget that comes up, you take the revised estimate, you take the final account.
Sure.
And I'm not even saying during the COVID period, I'm saying leave that such calamitous events out. The rest of the time, the finances are greatly varying in these statements. The numbers are greatly varying in these statements. Again, I said this to the Finance Commission of India when they came, the 15th Finance Commission. I said, if you look at the MTFP projections under the FRBM Act at the states, neither the union nor the states have a good track record of being able to project their own revenues, their own budget, and their own economy 1 year forward very well, let alone 2 years forward. How are you, the union government, going to project now 2 years forward and then 5 years from there? So from T+2 to T+7 for all states at that time and the union,
Sure.
and then make the devolution formula based on what those numbers are going to be. It's like an exercise in futility, right? It's like throwing at a dartboard that has the infinite spinning speed to be able to hit the bullseye. So I think, in theory, I have no problem with the logic of extending the granularity of the definition that's already in the 2015 guideline to a new guideline 22.
Sure.
I still say, why didn't you say so in the Supreme Court a little while ago? And why do you now act as if you've been looking for a loophole in which to follow some diktat and you're following it? And I worry that it's still going to be an exercise in futility because the numbers are so all over the place. Because if I read the guideline right, it says something
So
equivalent of
essentially,
that the government shall provide certain data
right.
as the basis on which that party shall now say what they're going to do in the manifesto. Well, the government's data itself turns out to be erratic.
Sure.
So what if that data is skewed when it's being provided? Is there an accountability factor in that? So these things get infinitely complicated and very hard to practically either enforce or actually create value out of. That's my concern.
Sure. Another question, one of the concerns that you had raised is whether or not the court should intervene in this matter at all. And that this was, in fact, a sentiment that was also echoed by Kapil Sibal. His advice was sought by the Chief Justice himself on this matter. He said, we have an FRBM mechanism. Let's tighten it. Let's add more teeth if at all required. But there is no need for the courts to intervene. What is your take on this? Is this an issue that should perhaps be debated in broader public domain, or is this perhaps the court is the best platform to adjudicate this issue?
I have never seen any democratic country, at least, and I think I've operated businesses or worked in a few dozen, and I've traveled to about 60. I have not yet seen a democratic country where
Sure.
the judicial system should be the decider of how money is raised or spent, right? That is almost in every democracy
Right.
the exclusive domain of elected legislators, and then through them the government, right? Because you have a house, you have to pass a budget. My concern is a bit more
Right.
profound in what you said, right? Because if you're going to look at who is really being controlled and who is being held accountable, in any democracy, we should not create a higher hurdle for opposition than those who are sitting in government. Right? We are sitting in the state government now. We're a regional party. At some level, I would say that we are in
Sure.
an advantageous situation if you make our opponents jump through hoops that we don't have to sitting in government. But as a believer
Sure.
in democracy and the constitution at heart, I ask the question, if you start applying some benchmark to people who are sitting outside the government that is effectively not binding on the people who are sitting
Right.
inside the government, is this good for democracy? First question.
Sure.
Second question, if you go down to a level of granularity about what is and isn't, good accounting or good logic or good finance. Let's say I give a statement. Let's say I'm going to finance it this way. Who is going to validate that that statement is actually a doable thing? Who's going to be the authority? Which neutral financial authority, of India is going to validate the possibility of my funding model for my freebie is
Sure.
valid or not valid? If I'm inside the government, it's very easy. I put it into the government's policy. I don't have to go through such a hoop. Now you go to the last part of your question, which is the whole
Sure.
question of FRBM and so forth. In fact, the FRBM has not been, in uniform value add across the country, right? If you look at the union government, I think the FRBM Act has been amended or effectively, extended the deadline for reaching compliance. Every year of the 18 years or 19 years has been in existence. In the state of Tamil Nadu, that was not the case. In the state of Tamil Nadu, it did a brilliant job. Our equivalent tax, you see, the FRBM only applies to the parliament. The equivalent act in Tamil Nadu is called the FRA Act, the Financial Responsibility Act in 2003. The FRA Act produced outstanding, brilliant results, right? The debt to GDP ratio of Tamil Nadu went down from 28% or so down to 16 or 17% in 11 or 12 years across ADMK, DMK, ADMK, across all the governments that have existed in that period. The interest to revenue ratio went down from something like 21% down to about 11%, again across both governments and multiple terms. It's only after Ms. Jayalalitha passed that it's become really defunct, and our predecessors ran it into the ground. We are correcting it, and we'll correct it much more rapidly than I thought by the leadership of the Chief Minister, the competence that we have, and the control that we're able to bring. But the question is that FRA is not the limiting factor for me. The limiting factor, how many ever times I amend the FRA in my assembly, on top of that, the union government sends us a letter every year and says that under Article 293.3 of the Constitution, this is the exact down to the last crore of rupees money that you shall borrow. This is your debt limit. So if there is already that much control on a state...
You raise a very interesting point about Article 293. Mr. Tyagarajan, you've raised a very interesting point about the exercise of power under Article 293. But that's a very large debate. I think we'll have to reserve that for another day. We'd like to thank you so much for joining us and sharing your very interesting thoughts. The matter, of course, continues before the top court. But just to get a sense of what the road ahead looks like, we're also joined by Mr. T.S. Krishnamurthy, former Chief Election Commissioner, and Ramesh Vaidyanathan, Managing Partner at Advaya Legal. Mr. Krishnamurthy, to you first. Your quick reading of, again, what Mr. Tyagarajan is calling a U-turn by the Election Commission. First, in the Supreme Court, EC's response was, we're not keen on participating in this exercise. And now we see they're seeking advice on modifying the MCC. Your quick take on that.
See, the model code of conduct has always been drawn in consultation with all the political parties. Any amendment to the model code of conduct had also been done in consultation with the political parties. I see no reason why Election Commission cannot consult them. I am surprised that somebody takes a stand that it reflects on the independence of the Election Commission. The Election Commission independence need not be asserted through such actions or such views. The Election Commission is always entitled to consult the political parties in drawing or amending the model code of conduct. So I see no reason or conflict in the action taken. The Election Commission could always have considered some more amendments to the model code of conduct in the context. And in that view, they have consulted the political parties. How does it reflect on the independence of the Election Commission? I'm rather surprised.
Sure.
And second point is...
Mr. Vaidyanathan, if I may come to you. I'll just come back to you, Mr. Krishnamurthy. Mr. Vaidyanathan, to you first. On the issue of, again, the conduct of the EC, this U-turn, as it is being called, the question that many are posing is that, look, this is a guideline that has been in place since 2015. Why did the EC choose to act now with the matter lying before the Supreme Court?
Hi, thank you. I don't think this is really a U-turn if you look at it that way, because what they've essentially said, I looked at the reply they have filed in the public interest litigation. What they've essentially said is that the courts cannot really decide this. So therefore, they have not really asked the court to either form an expert committee. In fact, they themselves have excused themselves from being part of any committee. They've said in a polite way, stay out of this. There are already guidelines that are existing. And in my personal view, Supreme Court could perhaps look at actually fortifying these guidelines, rather than, trying and appoint an expert committee and things like that, because that becomes free for all. And as the former Chief Election Commissioner mentioned, there is already a consultative mechanism in place. So there's no reason why, you need to really create a new setup for this purpose. And I think the crucial question, if I may just add, is, what exactly does a freebie mean? Because that's always a very tricky question, right? Would you call government hospitals a freebie, for example, free public transport, midday meals, IITs and IIMs? There is just no analytical way to meaningfully distinguish between social welfare policies and freebies. So I think this is an area that courts should be very, very circumspect in getting into.
Interesting thoughts. But that, unfortunately, is all the time that we have. We're pressed for time today. We'd like to thank all of our panelists, especially Mr. Krishnamurthy as well as Mr. Vaidyanathan, for being patient with us and sharing their insightful perspective with us. But with that, it's time now to slip into a very short break. But coming up on the other side, the government has notified a credit guarantee scheme to provide collateral-free loans to eligible startups. We discuss the contours on the other side. Welcome back now. And what could come as a big boost for the Indian startup ecosystem, the government has notified a credit guarantee scheme to provide collateral-free loans to eligible startups. According to the eligibility criteria, only those startups recognized by the DPIIT and those having reached a stable revenue stream and not in a default situation can avail credit under this scheme. Well, to understand how this scheme will benefit startups, I have with me Akhil Handa, Chief Digital Officer, Bank of Baroda. Mr. Handa, thank you so much for joining us. Give us a sense of what the appetite appears to be on the ground as far as startups are concerned, looking for such kind of funding solutions.
Thanks, Ashwin, for having me. I think, look, there is quite a bit of appetite in as far as the startups requirement for credit facilities is concerned, and specifically because in absence of credit facilities, startups normally have to resort to equity dilution. So this scheme of the government provides, to my mind, a new avenue for the startups to be able to diversify their funding book. There is obviously not every startup who is ready for credit facility, and some of it, the criteria has been explicitly spelled out by the notification, and the banks, I think, will add, or the member institutions will add further to the criteria as well.
Right. Mr. Handa, if I may come back to you with respect to the eligibility criteria, you think perhaps that could have been slightly more relaxed, perhaps a little more loosened to allow for a larger pool of startups that could have applied under the scheme?
For sure, you can always ask for more, right? But I think it's a great start, right? And I'll give you a sense of where the normal requirement looks like. See, we have more than 3,000 startups that bank with us through our Bob World startup channel, and what we see is we funded about 2% of these startups for credit facilities, right? Not a big number, right? Compared to the MSMEs, post-revenue, stable MSMEs that would come to the bank. Now, the average ticket size of these is almost 1.5 crore rupees, right? And considering that the government has kept a cap of about 10 crore rupees on the credit facility, to my mind, covers about 90% of the startups that we're looking at to get them started. Now, obviously, when a startup has already, they have access to facility, there is now a track record of repayment, down the line, they can always have a bilateral relationship without the credit facility from the bank or under the other credit facilities that are already existing as well. And you can take the guarantee scheme covers from SGTC, that is a CGT SME, etc. So there are other avenues available as you graduate, and I think up to 10 crore is a great starting point to my mind, and it's a very bold step by the government.
Sure. Interesting. An interesting new scheme to boost the ecosystem, the startup ecosystem. Mr. Handa, thank you so much for joining us. We'll, of course, try to connect with you again, maybe just a couple of quarters down the road to see what the traction is like on the ground. But that is all the time that we have for. It's a wrap on this edition of Business 360. Thanks so much for watching. Stay tuned to CNBC TV 18. The news and updates will continue on the other side.